define a startup, I mean, I did a bit of research trying to come up with what you'd call a startup, but I confess that my research did not bring up much, except to say that the idea is basic, that what constitutes a startup is an organization that is generally in its early years of operation, number one, and that is technology oriented, which would mean if you're looking at our presentations now, as we're looking at ICT, you'd be looking at the area of technology with regard to perhaps the internet and with regard to software and other elements that would arise from ICT. So generally, this term, startups, came about in the 1990s when we had the dot-com bubble coming about, because what would happen then is that even the search engines that we have today, the internet-based online trading systems that we have today were once upon a time startups. I'm sure you can think up a few examples, even if I won't mention them. And what has happened over the years is that these startups have grown into businesses that now have moved forward from being that basic form of business that is trying to find its feet and sell an idea that is relatively new into organizations that even have initial public offerings. And its relevance, of course, to us is that given that we have had a chance, probably from the 1990s to present day, to catch up, so to speak, with our more industrialized counterparts, and looking at our ambition then to have a Silicon Valley of sorts, a Silicon Valley sort of contemporary here, and that was spoken about yesterday, then we would be looking at what issues would come about relating to IP that would affect such startups that we're looking to have. If you are to look at what constitutes a startup, going back to my introduction, then you would see that having mentioned that these businesses are technology-oriented and that, number two, they are at the initial level of operation, IP issues would interact with them automatically. If you have technology orientation, what that means is that you're coming up with something new, more often than not. And what does that bring about? It brings about the idea that you'd probably want to patent what you're coming up with. So already you can see that interaction with IP and a business that is a startup. So moving to the second part of my presentation, where basically I'm looking at how specifically now the IP issues would come into the day-to-day running of the business, I'm going to divide it into two. I'm going to look at the life cycle of a business, and if you look at what I'm going to be talking about, even if you thought about a current going concern, these are issues that would be inherent in such a going concern, such that it's just that this business is starting up and probably those other going concerns have been in the market for some time. So coming back to the life cycle, you'd have the three stages that you'd expect of growth of a progression of a business, maybe from the time it starts to the time maybe it comes to an end, if that is an option that that business would want to consider. And that life cycle would entail, number one, the establishment of the business, number two, its growth, and then thirdly, you'd have the option to exit. So if we come back to the establishment of the business, what are we looking at? We are looking at the products or services and the IP that is created therein. If you're coming up with a product or a service that you'd like to sell to your consumers out there, then if you're technology oriented, then there will be intellectual property created therefrom because you have new ideas coming in, and you'd probably use one of the many mechanisms that we've been discussing since yesterday to be able to protect what it is you're coming up with. So we would have copyright coming in there, we would have trademarks, copyright, of course, to protect what it is you express, what you publish from the ideas that you have. You'd have trademarks, which would protect your manner of expressing your identity. be it a name, be it a logo. You'd also have patents. If what you have is an invention and it happens to meet the criteria that are there under Kenyan law, then you'd qualify for a patent, all things being constant. And then now you'd have trade secrets. If you have a trade secret, then that is what is your advantage in the market, what you have that your competitors out there don't have, and therefore gives you that competitive edge. And you'd also want to protect that. Now you'll find that as you move from the point of establishment of the business, these modes of protection that I have mentioned will still be pertinent to your business. But we will now move to another area of that business where you move from either the founder, who is an individual, or a number of founders coming up with that idea and talking about protecting it and actually going ahead and protecting it and doing all that is necessary to set up the business, moving to the area where now the business needs to move from the seed into a seedling. So at this point in time, you'd be looking at how does this fledgling business interact with core developers who may come on board if you're talking about technology. How does it deal with suppliers, people who supply this business with either their ideas or whatever physical resources would be required for such a business. You'd be looking at who sells, who distributes what this business is coming up with. And further to that, you'd be looking at probably licensing whatever it is you've already come up with. In today's earlier presentation, I think we've been encouraged, I would say, to think more towards strategy. In as much as this IP is available for you to protect yourself and to protect your product, it also bears an amount of consideration as to what it is that you want to do with your product and what your business strategy is going to be. So you will not necessarily even undertake to probably continue using what it is you've come up with. You might consider licensing it just to be able to make maximum revenue out of it. Considering that you're a startup, you'd probably have the element of probably not enough capital inherent in that business. Of course, there are startups that are able to attract investors even as they are still at this growth stage, but here I'm looking at a business that is struggling to get people to accept this new idea that they've come up with, and they would like to get people to come on board and give it and have some capital to get it moving, but they're not yet there. Licensing is an option that they could consider. So now if you're licensing the product or service, you're working with core developers in all the levels that are there in a business where you're talking about production, marketing, and selling of the product of the service. This is where now agreements will come in, and this is where the legal aspect, in terms of looking at what it is you have and what it is you are dealing with in your interactions with this person, will be governed by agreements. So you'd be looking at the IP that would be dealt with in those agreements, aside from all the other elements, the other practical elements that would concern exactly maybe how payments are going to be made and such other matters that relate to a contract. You would come to the part that deals with IP, and it would be necessary at this point for you, if you have a startup, to be very clear as to how it is you intend to deal with IP. If you've come up with the IP and you're inviting others, maybe in the form of a joint venture to work with you, exactly who owns the IP, you want to be able to determine that. You also want to be able to determine, if you're licensing, what rights exactly do these people who get licenses from you get? Because at the end of the day, just coming back to the idea of strategy, you want to be able to make maximum revenue out of this product that you've come up with, and you do not want to lose. You've invested after all. The other element that you might want to consider is sale or purchase of these IPRs. Just moving away maybe from licensing and considering that even as your business is progressing, you're having a chance to monitor it, you're having a chance to maybe see what projections you're looking at. It would be better maybe to exit, at which point you might consider selling whatever IP you have come up with. Now, at this point in time, you'd have a sale agreement that would govern whatever other elements of the business that you would want to trade in, but you'd also be looking at how does this asset that is called IP factor into all this? How do I want to value it? How do I want to sell it? Exactly when does the property actually pass? Because this is rather probably straightforward in terms of physical goods that you're dealing with, but with IP you want to be sure. You want to be able to complete the necessary documentation and be able to transfer that IP in that situation. Also, at the stage of growth of a business, you might encounter situations where you have disputes with these persons that I've talked about just previously. Where you have disputes coming up, then you would want to think about what route do you want to take? Do you want to, if you're the person who feels that somebody has overstepped your boundaries, do you want to take this matter to court? Do you want to consider arbitration? Do you want to consider mediation? Just, of course, depending on your strategy and what it is you want out of it. Of course, if the shoe is on the other foot and you're the one caught out, stepping on somebody's toes, then probably that would not really be an option. If somebody files suit against you, then you'd have to approach them in court and maybe in time reach an out-of-court settlement if that's not what you want. But basically, this would be something to consider even as you're entering into these agreements. It would be a good idea, considering, I think there was an experience given to us either earlier today or yesterday about court cases that have gone on for considerably long periods of time. It would be good for you to consider dispute resolution as one of the elements that you look at in the contracts that you enter into. This becomes useful, of course, as this business grows and as it encounters the usual hurdles that any person probably would encounter in day-to-day running of a business. If you're at the stage of growth, more often than not, you've moved from looking at just yourselves as maybe the ideas people to having people working for you who are probably implementing these ideas or coming up with ideas of their own that are going to drive this business forward. So in such a situation, you probably have employees, which would necessitate that you come up with employment agreements. Now, it is important, again, when you're interacting with employees to have contracts that make it very clear who owns what. Now, you'll find under the Industrial Property Act, Section 32, there is an outright provision there that makes it clear that if somebody is working for you as an employee and they come up with IP using your resources, then that IP belongs to you as the employer. But for your own sake and just to make it as painless as possible, getting to sort out some of these matters, it would be useful to have that element of IP feature in your employment contract so that you're clear from the get-go as to who owns what. And then thirdly, I have looked at exit, which is an option that, again, you'd want to take if you decide at some point that for one reason or another, you do not want to continue running this business. So again, I go back to the element of valuation of the IP. And valuation of IP is a slightly technical subject, which I would say is outside my scope as an advocate, but I know there are some basic things, there are some basic elements that would be considered if you're going to value IP. You'd probably consider, just like with any other asset, what did it cost to come up with the IP? Can you determine how much it cost you to come up with the IP? Can you determine exactly how much revenue you're making now out of this IP and what is projected revenue? Then you'd be able to probably, using that factor, those two factors and other factors probably that experts would be able to advise you on, be able to come up with what you'd call the value of that IP, even as you're selling whatever other physical assets you're selling. And now, together with the agreement for sale that sets out exactly how, once again, that IP is transferred, then you'd be able to effect transfer if you decide to exit the market. Now, the second part of my presentation, the second, I'd call them sections, so to speak. If I was drawing a chart, maybe I couldn't draw a chart very well, but there are two elements. So I've looked at the life cycle of the business. Now I'm looking at whatever business model you might decide to adopt and how that interacts with IP. So business models generally dictate how you will run how you're going to create value for your consumer and exactly how you're going to deliver it to them. So what does this entail? How do you create value for your customer? What goods are you producing? What services are you producing? And ultimately, how are you getting them to your consumer? Again, going back to the idea of business strategy and exactly how much you want to invest in terms of whatever resources are available to you, it will be useful to consider whether you want to adopt a model that takes up your resources in production, in marketing, in distributing the goods or services finally to the consumer, in which case now you'd have to consider the IP that is created in the cost of you manufacturing the business, the IP that is useful for you in terms of marketing, whatever products you create, and also in dealing with the people that you finally distribute to, how exactly you protect your IP in terms of ensuring that it's registered such that infringement becomes something that you can deal with should it arise in future. You could also consider a model that outsources production, meaning that you want to take up less of the responsibility that goes with coming up with a product or service, meaning that you would probably want to sit at your office and have somebody else produce whatever it is, given that maybe it's a physical product, come up with it and then bring it to you, and then you can handle the rest of the selling, or maybe even still outsource that. So in such a case, then, you'd be looking at who owns the IP. If you're going to outsource the whole element of having it produced, then you'd want to make it very clear in the agreement who owns this IP. And then in scenarios where you're going to consider outsourcing, you'd probably want to consider what happens to independent contractors, because sometimes it is the case that the resources that you have in your farm cannot come up with what it is you want to come up with, and from time to time you'll probably need to ask a consultant to come on board to assist you with A, B, C, D. So just like with employment contracts, you will want to have it put in the contract, in your contract of engagement with this independent contractor, that the IP will belong to so and so. At the end of the day, you want to be able to secure yourself, and should matters proceed to litigation, you want to be able to have something that you can stand firm on. And then the third business model that I considered would be the hybrid, whereby you outsource sometimes, or you outsource part of it and then you produce the other part of it. Again, a decision that would be guided by your strategy as a business. And of course, the hybrid now would also consider whatever it is I've mentioned as part of the outsourced business and as part of the business that takes up practically every aspect of the production cycle. Now, I've moved to challenges relating to IP that are faced by startups. Now, the first one that I'm going to look at is cost. And here, cost is in terms of registration of the intellectual property. Earlier today, we had a presentation that was about the registration in jurisdictions outside Kenya, and I think some of those figures were rather high, and there were a few comments made about that. So a business such as this, given sometimes that there might be capital constraints, would be facing the challenge of cost in terms of registration of that IP, in terms of maintenance of that IP registration. If you need to renew it, then that's a cost. And then also the element of litigation that might come about as a result of you having that IP. And from a practitioner's perspective, I can tell you that there are many businesses that start out with ideas that look like they could actually take flight, but once the business person concerned sits down to consider the cost of registration of the IP, then they become rather discouraged and tell you that they'll get back to you later, which more often than not doesn't happen. So cost is a great discouraging factor when it comes to IP and startups. And then also the time taken in registration of the IP. We've looked at, or we've heard from previous presentations about the amount of time it would take to register a patent. If you're looking at time frames that go from a year and a half to 2 years, and you, at the end of the day, want to have a monopoly, then that might be a bit long for the businessman who just wants to get his business up and running and not have to deal with all the other incidentals that come about as a result of you wanting to have a business. And then thirdly, the other problem that you'd be dealing with would be keeping information confidential. Now, a large part of IP, given that there are ideas and probably there's the element of novelty, you'd want to keep some of these ideas to yourself until such time as you're able to now protect them. So if you have employees and other persons working for you, if, like I've said, you're engaging independent contractors, you're working with core developers, then keeping information confidential about what this new thing you're developing is might become a challenge. Now, in the last part of my presentation, I look at how it is you can deal with some of these elements that I have mentioned. Now, just following on from that challenge to keep matters confidential, I would start with looking at how you can try and have confidentiality remain an aspect of your business even before you release information to the outside world. There are many suggestions that have been made, and probably one of the more effective ones, and I think it's worked for a particular soft drink company, probably up until this time, is to release the information on a need-to-know basis, such that information is only released to those who need to have it. And in that manner, then you're able to sort of keep a lead on it and have some element of control. Not that any of these methods is foolproof, of course, but just to try and surmount the challenge that comes about from trying to keep information confidential. Then you'd also restrict access, you enter into non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements, and that sort of thing to be able to keep information secret. And then identification of the IP is something that you'd probably want to alert your employees to. If you're having employees who are coming on board to help you develop what it is you're going to be putting out into the market, you would want to consider enlightening them as to how it is that, as to maybe a system whereby they tell you from time to time that they've been able to come up with something that they think is new. Maybe you can have briefings from time to time to have employees report to you and let you know that this is what they're coming up with, so that if in the course of such discussions you're able to identify that something new has been developed, then you can go ahead and speedily register whatever it is that you've been able to come up with. Because with delay, there is the increased risk of loss of confidentiality, and your competitors could take advantage of that same information and go ahead and get the protection before you get it. Now, lastly, you'd be looking at monitoring your IP. And monitoring is in terms of, number one, maintenance of whatever IP it is you have registered. If you have an IP that requires constant maintenance, then you need to make sure that your payments are up to date such that your element of registration remains intact. And also monitoring in terms of seeing whether or not your product is, whether or not there is infringement of whatever product it is that you're putting out into the market. You would need to monitor as a way of managing that IP so that it continues to serve you for, hopefully, as long as you'd want it to serve you for. Now that marks the end of my presentations. If there are questions, I can take them now.